Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Today we're talking about what has been buzzing around for several days in what used to be called the blogger knackle. Back when blogging was big, there was this, I don't know what you would call it, a community of LDS-oriented blogs. A lot of them are still out there, but I feel like the blogger knackle is not as big as it once was or as much of a focus now with social media and everyone on other platforms. For example, I was heavily blogging during that same era, and I haven't blogged in I don't know, 5+ years now, just because conversations have shifted elsewhere. But the buzz all this week, all over social media, at least in the circles that I run in, was this new SEC penalty that came down against the church. The church, along with Ensign Peak, which we'll get into, which is like the church's investment arm, they were fined a total of $5 million for an allegation that they had been intentionally fudging information or withholding information. So I want to talk a little bit about that, my thoughts, but then pull it into kind of the doctrinal issue that I think underlies that whole experience that few people are really talking about. So let's start with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, federal government's arm to kind of make sure that there's transparency for investors and that companies aren't defrauding investors and things like that. Now, I am no fan of the SEC, like any three-letter federal agency. I don't like a lot of what they've done. I think a lot of what they've done is dumb. But in this particular instance, it appears that the complaint that they had against the LDS Church and its investment arm does have merit. So I'll read a very brief portion and then we'll talk about it. So this comes from the SEC, not as part of the complaint, I believe. I think it may have been part of the commentary around it. This may actually be in the complaint. I can't remember where I got it. It says this: the church was concerned that the disclosure of its investment portfolio, which by 2018 grew to approximately $32 billion, would lead to negative consequences. To obscure the amount of the church's portfolio, and with the church's knowledge and approval, Ensign Peak created 13 shell LLCs, ostensibly with locations throughout the United States, and filed Forms 13F in the names of these LLCs rather than in Ensign Peak's name. Now, 13F is a form that the federal government requires these types of investment managers to fill out to be transparent about their different holdings and activities. The 13F, it's actually, I believe it's quarterly. It's time delayed, and so it's not a really good indication. The SEC, as I understand it, has other tools that are more in real time to be able to monitor and track investments. But the Form 13F, nonetheless, is a required federal form for these types of investment managers to be filling out on a quarterly basis to be notifying the federal government as to the different market activities of the investments that they manage. So what happened is that Ensign Peak, they were sitting on this big, multi-tens of billions of dollars of church investments. And church leadership desired to keep that amount secret, to make it difficult for anyone to have access to the information. And so on legal advice, they had legal counsel. They didn't say who. I'm going to guess it's Kurt McConkie. We're going to do a whole other musing about Kurt McConkie and how much the church is led by lawyers today and what Jesus said about that long ago. But they said they sought legal counsel that guided them in setting up literal shell companies, 13 LLCs, to redirect the investments through these LLCs and instead fill out the 13F form on behalf of the LLCs. Now, the person, the entity that's supposed to fill out these forms is the person in charge of controlling the money. In other words, if I'm an investment manager and I'm managing $1 billion, if I'm the ultimate CEO of that investment management company, I am the one who's signing off on the 13F. I have direct control and oversight over those investments. Well, it would follow then that if the church had legal counsel to break up their funds into 13 different companies rather than one company, that to fill out the 13 Fs, the heads of these LLCs, those people would have to then now be the ones in charge of the amount of money allocated to that LLC. That is not at all what happened. These were just shell companies through which Ensign Peak, under advisement from senior church leadership, redirected the money, but gave the LLCs no control over the money. Ensign Peak retained total control. So these were literal shell companies that were created. This is from the SEC complaint. The business managers of these clone LLCs, the ones who were filling out the 13F for each little LLC, these business managers were selected because they had common names and a limited presence on social media and were therefore less likely to be connected to Ensign Peak or the church. Because initially, before this was happening, apparently there was a concern that the individual signing the 13F could be connected to the church because he was in leadership or he had some kind of position with the church. And they wanted to have the investments at arm's length. They didn't want people to be able to connect the investments to the church. And so they created these 13 LLCs and, according to the complaint, sought out individuals who had bland, generic names that would not really be found on social media and therefore more difficult for someone to sniff around and find that these companies, these LLCs rather, were connected to Ensign Peak and thus the church. Now, all of this was done under the direct supervision and approval of the, quote, senior leadership of the church. So according to the SEC, they say, as referenced in this order, the complaint, or the penalty rather, senior leadership of the church consists of the church's first presidency and presiding bishopric. So this was decided at the very top, this effort to deprive the public more broadly, but also church members themselves, with information about the church's investments. And it's, in a sense, not really the church's investments. Perhaps it's our investments. And I'm going to talk about whether that's the case, because is it our money? Is it the church's money? Do we have some say or stake in it? Is there some obligation to be reporting to us and so forth? We're going to get into that and what the scriptures say about it. But this was done under the direct auspices of senior leadership, who said that they were operating on legal advice. So presumably Kurt McConkie told them, oh yeah, just, because they had this directive of growing the funds, the billions of dollars, grow the money, but maximize privacy. In other words, we don't want people to know about it. So go to whatever links you need to legally to do this. So they sought legal counsel. Legal counsel said, oh, just set up all these shell companies. But the problem was that these LLCs did not have control over the money. Therefore, they should not have been the ones filing out the LLCs. Okay, so the church admitted wrongdoing. They said mea culpa, and they agreed to a settlement where they are paying $5 million. $1 million for the church, $4 million for Ensign Peak. And and this is this is interesting because when you read the church's press release about this whole issue, at the bottom they say, we affirm our commitment to comply with the law, regret mistakes made, and now consider this matter closed. What do you think about that response? We affirm our commitment to comply with the law, we regret mistakes made, and now consider this matter closed. I saw a funny little cartoon or meme that someone put together of someone sitting with their bishop, and it's like a disciplinary type meeting. They've done some grave sin, and the bishop is like, oh, we got to talk about this. And the lady who's sitting there confessing or whatever, she says, I regret mistakes made, and now consider this matter closed. And the bishop's like, oh, but, she said, closed, period. I consider this matter closed. Well, maybe it's closed for purposes of the SEC, but I think there's an open question, at least in my mind, as to whether the matter is closed with respect to members themselves. Like, you might argue that the church owes some type of explanation to the very members of the church who are funding the investments that the church is making and for which they were trying to play fast and loose and kind of hide the information. One could argue, thus, that the church should explain what went wrong, what legal counsel was obtained, why the decision was made, and what happened as a result, right? But to just say, oh, we paid $1 million, we issued a press release, we're sorry, and we now consider this matter closed, might be, and I think is, rather insufficient in actually admitting wrongdoing and explaining to the membership at large what happened and why it happened. That hasn't happened. The church's press release was not directed to members of the church. Maybe we'll hear something at General Conference, though I doubt it. And look, at the end of the day, this is a federal law, and I support, as you all know, civil disobedience and breaking stupid laws, and not all laws are laws. So I am not one to say that the church has to rigidly obey every jot and tittle of federal law. That to me is not what this is about. But I do find it a little bit interesting that for the church in its temple recommend interviews that requires of us being honest in our dealings with our fellow man, the church, according to this type of activity, cannot itself answer that type of question because they were being deceptive in this regard to effectively launder the investments through shell LLCs for the sole purpose of evading public scrutiny or informing members. So why? Why did they do this? Well, Roger Clark, he was at least, may still be, the head of Ensign Peak Advisors, which is the church's investment arm. And he said that church leaders were concerned that the knowledge of the fund, the investments, would discourage regular donations from its members, known as tithes, according to the Wall Street Journal. Roger Clark said, and I quote, "They, the senior leaders of the church, they never wanted to be in a position where people felt like, they shouldn't make a contribution." So ostensibly, the whole reason why this happened, the whole reason why senior leaders of the church, the very top leaders, directed Ensign Peak to suppress this information and set up shell companies was because they wanted to keep the tithing funds a-flowing. Now, those of you who have been faithful listeners of these Sunday musings know that I allege and strongly believe that the church teaches tithing wrong and teaches it in a way that allows it to amass far more money than we are actually required under God's law to give. That musing was on August 28th of last year. If you want to jot that down, scroll back another time and go listen in your preferred podcast app. But so I'm not going to dig into the tithing aspect because I've given that separate treatment. I only want to acknowledge that past musing and reiterate that, maybe not reiterate, but just say that if that's the concern, if that's why these investments were being hid because they didn't want to disincentivize people from sacrificing and paying a full tithing, that to me is very problematic. Because the people who are going to give are going to give. They're giving it because God has commanded it. They're not giving it because, people who are looking for an excuse to not pay tithing, this would be a welcome excuse. But those people were going to find one anyways. They were going to stop paying tithing anyways. The faithful followers who are trying to be followers of Christ are going to obey the law of tithing, and they're going to pay. They're going to pay anyways. So I don't think that fear, because this was fear. It was fear of members not paying their tithing if word got out that we have tens of billions of dollars under management by our investment company. That fear, I don't think, leads to good decisions. I don't think fear is a good basis in which to make sound, wise decisions. And this, to me, it was just a decision born of fear. The head of Ensign Peak Advisors, who works under the direct supervision of the senior leaders of the church, admitted as much publicly. Says that the senior leaders never wanted to be in a position where people felt like, they shouldn't make a contribution. So they wanted to hide and suppress the information. They did not want transparency. They wanted to maintain an image of a church that's lean and mean and, I don't know. But they don't want this idea in people's minds that it's this massively wealthy mega church that doesn't actually need our money. So again, I don't think fear is the right way to make decisions like this. Now, this is not the first you've heard of all of this. In 2019, there was a so-called whistleblower, so about 3 years ago. This was a 41-year-old Mormon dude who worked at Ensign Peak Advisors. He worked at this investment firm as a senior portfolio manager. His name's David Nielsen. And Nielsen, he came out with this whole supposed whistleblower complaint. He accused church leaders of misleading members and possibly breaching federal tax rules by stockpiling their surplus donations instead of using them for charitable works. He also accused leaders of using the tax-exempt donations to prop up a pair of businesses. So I'm going to get into that in just a moment, why I think this Nielsen guy was wrong. But what I find interesting is that the next day, after this complaint came out, the church issued a press release responding to the allegations. And they said, and I quote, "The church complies with all applicable law governing our donations, investments, taxes, and reserves." Well, that wasn't true. I mean, I don't care if you want to say, "Oh, we don't ignore, or we don't follow stupid laws. We don't like doing that reporting for these." If you just want to engage in a little civil disobedience and push back, I'll support you, right? I got no problem with that. But to publicly state that you are complying with all applicable law governing investments 3 years ago, when in fact that was not the case, when the church was intentionally rerouting funds to shell LLCs for the sole purpose of evading public transparency, that statement to me 3 years ago seems disingenuous and inaccurate. Now, for his part, Nielsen's complaint is just bogus. Nonprofits, including churches, can invest money. They can operate for-profit companies. I mean, Libertas, we invest money. Most nonprofits invest money. They set up an endowment. They try and grow funds for the long term, because what if donations, dry up at some point? You need to be able to still do the work. So that's just prudent financial management for running an organization, a tiny one like Libertas, let alone a massive worldwide church. And so to say that they're stockpiling their surplus donations instead of using them for charitable works, I think is ridiculous. The church uses a ton of money for charitable works. I personally wish it was more. I'd be okay with more simple temples and more, charitable, help the poor type of projects. But to argue otherwise is silly, that the church isn't, doing any of it or stockpiling all of its donations. And the parable of the talents, Jesus taught, he praised and rewarded the servant that went and invested and put to work his talents to produce additional ones. And the one who sat on it to protect it and, keep it safe or whatever was castigated, was chastised. So it's prudent for the church to invest a portion of its financial resources, to put it to work, to generate additional revenue for a future time. I have zero problem with that. And this allegation that, using tax-exempt donations to prop up a pair of businesses. Nonprofits can operate for-profit businesses. They can engage in business activity. All of the Tuttle Twins books, which are sold, for profit, are done through our nonprofit. This is very common, and there's zero problem. So Nielsen's whistleblower thing is, in my mind, just poppycock. But I did find the church's response interesting, saying we obey all laws regarding investments, when they didn't at the time 3 years ago, and that's the whole reason that they were penalized. Okay, so why is all this happening? Why is this happening in 2023? Well, until 1959, the church's finances were transparent. In fact, every April, the church would publish a financial report. For almost half a century leading up to that 1959 report, the church would offer fairly detailed reports every April in the General Conference. From some limited research I was able to do from a few church historians, it appears that it changed in 1959 because one of the counselors in the first presidency, Henry Moyle, was on a spending spree to build a ton of chapels and really expand missionary work, with the hopes that that would bring in new converts who would pay tithing to help cover the expenses and the investment of building out all those buildings and paying for all the added missionary work. And so he was put in charge of all the finances, and apparently he overspent, the church overspent by millions of dollars. Of course, back in the 50s, the church's budget was far, far, far smaller than it is today. So he put the church into debt. He spent more money, millions more, than the church had brought in. And according to one historian I read, it was President Moyle in the first presidency who persuaded David O. McKay, who was president of the church, to withhold the detailed financial reports from the church membership so as not to have to reveal the overcommitment in spending because of this acute circumstance with building a lot of buildings and expanding missionary work. And apparently McKay went along with that, and I don't know if it was ever revisited, but that became the new policy. And since 1959, we have not had detailed financial information as church members regarding how the church is spending the money that we contribute to it. What we do now have, as you know, we probably have it memorized at this point because of how many times we've heard it in our life, is when the head of the church auditing department gets up in general conference once a year and he says, church auditing, which consists of credentialed professionals and is independent of all other church departments and entities, has responsibility to perform audits for the purpose of providing reasonable assurance regarding contributions received, expenditures made, and safeguarding of church's assets. Based upon audits performed, church auditing is of the opinion that, in all material respects, contributions received, expenditures made, and assets of the church for the year blank, whatever the year is, have been recorded and administered in accordance with church-approved budgets, accounting practices, and policies. So we hear that every year, and that's all we hear. We are not privy to the details. We don't have access to the data, because apparently President Moyle in 1959 didn't want to be embarrassed by church members or criticized for putting the church back into debt. It had struggled in all of its early years for debt, and many church leaders were badgering members to pay more tithing to get the church out of debt. Well, here was Moyle spending more than the church had brought in, and instead of being forthright and transparent about it, he asked the church president to hide it. And they did. And ever since, it's all been hidden. You might say, and I alluded to this earlier, well, it's not my money, it's the Lord's. I've heard this argument many times from people who wash their hands of it and say, I will be blessed for paying my tithing. What happens after that is not up to me. It's the Lord's church. The Lord, supports who he calls, qualifies who he calls, whatever that quote is. And church leaders, if there's any shenanigans or any problems, they'll be held accountable to God. Not my problem. To me, that's kind of like voting for someone and being like, I just voted for the guy. What he does is up to someone else. I don't have to monitor things. I don't have to pay attention to his votes. I just, filled in a bubble on the election ballot that one time, and I get to wash my hands of it. And whatever that guy does is not my problem. It's a very disengaged, apathetic, and irresponsible approach to managing the affairs of an organization, whether the government or the church. Any human institution operates better with sunlight. And church leaders, though overwhelmingly, I'm sure, amazing people, are still fallible, are still human. And church history, both ancient and modern, is full of examples of, we can call it corruption and intrigue and, self-serving behaviors. We're humans. It happens. So transparency is always the best. And we'll get into some of the scriptures in just a moment. One of the things that I find concerning is how, about a decade ago or so, a new disclaimer was put onto the tithing slip that the church provides for people to contribute money. And at the time, it said, though reasonable, when they did this change, I think it was 2012, it said, though reasonable efforts will be made globally to use donations as designated, all donations become the church's property and will be used at the church's sole discretion to further the church's overall mission. Most recently, they've modified it a little bit. Now it says that all donations to the church are free will offerings, and become the church's property. In furtherance of its overall mission, the church may shift donations from any designated use to other uses at its sole discretion. So if you want to contribute money to the temple fund, or if you want to contribute money to missionaries or to humanitarian aid or welfare beyond what you're obligated to do for tithing, one might conclude that the average person would want the money going to where they donated. But for at least a decade now, the church's position has been that it's all fungible, that you can check whatever box you want, but any money that you give just goes into the big pot and they can move it around as they please. Now, I don't think that's entirely unreasonable. For example, let's say a new temple is being built, and let's say members in the area are solicited for financial support to contribute to the temple. And let's say people are so excited by the temple that the members just open their wallets and throw a ton of money at the church to help. Let's say the church needed, I don't know, we'll say $5 million, okay? Let's say the church needed $5 million. And let's say they raised 7.5 of people who had said, I want the money going to that temple. Well, now the church has a $2.5 million surplus. Should their hands be tied such that that money can only be used for that temple when they no longer need the funds for that temple? They have enough. So I think it's reasonable to allow the church a certain amount of discretion to be able to move the money around as needed. However, that is all contingent on transparency. Like if I contribute money to something, and like we do this with our donors, I'll have a donor who gives me money and turns out we can't work on that project anymore, or we had to pivot and do something differently. I go back to them and I say, hey, really appreciate the support. I need to let you know that this has been changed a little bit. Do you mind if we apply that donation over here? And like 100% of the time they say yes. They appreciate the information, the communication, the accountability, and then we move the money around because any organization has to do that. You need the flexibility and discretion to be able to move resources around. But there's got to be a certain level of transparency to the donor. I'm not legally obligated to go to those donors because, like the church is saying on the tithing slip, once my donor gives my nonprofit some money, it's our property. They have no say or control. But if I want them to keep giving in the future, and just for ethical reasons, it makes sense to still have that communication and still have a certain level of transparency to say, hey, I know you gave to this. I know you intended us to do this. We need to let you know what's going on. The church does not do that. And I think that is a little bit of a problem. Now, on the one hand, donor privacy is very important. For example, consider Prop 8 in California, the whole ballot measure to say that marriage is between a man and a woman. And there was an effort to obtain the names and addresses of people who had donated money towards that campaign. And it included many members of the church. And some of that information got out. And opponents were able to go target those people and intimidate them. And, church buildings were spray painted and all this stuff, right? And so donor privacy is critical. You should have the right in private to donate to any institution that you want. This is something that we've been involved with supporting across the country. Here in Utah, we sued the government a few years ago along with the Taxpayers Association because of a state law that was trying to compel nonprofits to disclose our donors. And we sued, and the Attorney General conceded it was unconstitutional and agreed to not enforce the law at all. And then we got the legislature to go repeal that law. And then we got a new law passed explicitly protecting donor privacy. So as it pertains to the church, donor privacy, very important. But that is a very different matter from the expenditures of the institution. So I don't have to reveal publicly to anyone who donates to my nonprofit. That's private information. We keep it very private. However, we are required annually to fill out what's called a Form 990, where we disclose all of our different expenditures and so forth. That's public information. Churches are not required, interestingly, to fill out 990s. That's interesting. So I'm all about protecting donor privacy, but I believe that any institution not because of some stupid government or law or an annual IRS 990, but it's prudent to have a level of accountability to your supporters, to your contributors, and to disclose how the money was used, which is why I think financial transparency is so important. Okay, let's end with the doctrine. D&C 26, verse 2 says that all things shall be done by common consent in the church. D&C 104, 71, this is talking about the united firm and consecration, although the same lesson applies. It says that church funds that are people's money contributions that are being put into the Lord's treasury shall, quote, not be used or taken out of the treasury only by voice and common consent. In other words, we're all pooling our money together, we're all contributing to this effort. Any expenditures made have to be by common consent. What's interesting, do you remember a moment ago when I was raising this question of, is it our money or is it the church's money? Right? Do we have any obligation or accountability or interest in knowing how the money is spent after we've just signed the money away? Well, verse 70, the verse right before the one I just read, says this, and let not any among you say that it is his own, the contribution, the money that you're giving. Don't let anyone among you say that it's his own, for it shall not be called his, nor any part of it. So at least in consecration, the Lord is making clear that you are kind of surrendering the money at the point of contribution. It is now the Lord's, it is not yours. But consent is still needed because the following verse says, like, okay, if Connor contributes $10 to the Lord's, storehouse or treasury, it's no longer my $10, it's the Lord's. However, any expenditure made, right, let not anything be taken out of the treasury only by voice and common consent. So it's not my property anymore, but there still has to be common consent for how the money is used. Okay, what does that mean? Consent. 1828 Webster's Dictionary, the go-to for when we're talking about scriptural stuff, defines consent as an agreement of the mind to what is proposed or stated by another, an accord, hence a yielding of the mind or will to that which is proposed. So an agreement of the mind, a yielding of the mind, an accord. I believe that you cannot have consent unless it is informed consent. I mean, this is the whole reason why we criminalize, sex with a minor, for example, because children can't consent. They lack the intellectual faculty and the mental processing to be able to make rational decisions, right? And so we understand that consent requires information. It requires the ability for accountability. And so can you truly consent to something if you are not informed? Can you buy a house on just a verbal promise and really be held accountable for paying a mortgage or anything unless you were provided all the information about how much you're going to pay, how often you'll pay it, what will happen if you don't pay it, X, Y, and Z. If you've ever bought a house, you know all those forms you got to sign because it's informed consent. It's consent, which requires being informed. And so I believe that if there's an environment in which there is no information, then you can't truly, or at least meaningfully, give consent. We might call it superficial consent, nominal consent, but I don't think that's what the scriptures are getting after. Over and over in the scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, talks about, for example, in Mosiah 29, the business being conducted by the voice of the people. And all throughout the scriptures, you have the voice of the people, this idea of common consent. You can't deprive people of information and expect them to be able to agree to something when they don't know what they're agreeing to. So, in my mind, then, the 1959 change was a mistake. It may have been done for kind of self-serving reasons by Moyle pushing for it to not look bad in front of church membership. I don't know. But I believe that all the business of the church is required to be conducted by common consent, and that you can't have consent without information, and that we are required, according to the Doctrine and Covenants, to have common consent for church expenditures as well as just who the leaders are. Because we have that, right? When a new apostle is called or a new 70 or whatever. Everyone raises their hand, and you get some cranky person in the conference center who shouts and they get escorted out. Or if you're in ward council and someone doesn't raise their hand, they're invited to talk after with a member of the stake presidency or the bishopric. But we have consent there, at least a process acknowledging that people can dissent. You can say no, you can say I object to this, I disagree with this, I have a concern about that person being called. I know something, I know what they did, I know what they said, I know what they're not doing. So because of that information, I can't consent, therefore I dissent and I object and I'm going to raise my hand. And so that can happen. We do that with sustainings for leadership positions. But because we lack any information about church expenditures, all we get is an auditor standing up and saying, trust me, guys, we're independent. We got it all figured out. Everything's A-okay. Just believe me, right? And it's not that I disbelieve that auditor or think that there's any shenanigans happening. I don't. But that's not the point. The point is that there isn't consent because we're not informed. And so we've reduced, potentially undermining the spirit, if not the letter of the law and the Doctrine and Covenants, for not operating on the consent of the people. But we're not truly or meaningfully obtaining the consent of the church members because information is being withheld from them. It's been withheld from them since 1959. And these investments, for example, right? More information being withheld as a result of setting up all these shell LLCs to try and deprive people of information. President Hinckley, in 2002, he was being interviewed in connection with the Olympics. There were a lot of people that were interested in the church, obviously, with Utah hosting the Olympics. The reporter asked, he's a foreign reporter, he says, in my country, we say the people's churches, the Protestants, the Catholics, they publish all their budgets to all the public. Why is it impossible for your church? So 21 years ago, President Hinckley replied, well, we simply think that information belongs to those who made the contribution and not to the world. So if it belongs to us, if it belongs to me as a tithe payer, where do I access it? I mean, could it be put in like the LDS Tools app on your phone and you could just scroll through PDFs and look at line item budgets and stuff? Like, put it behind the login so that only church members can access it. I'm cool with that. I have no problem with withholding it from general public view because the church is not legally obligated in the United States to disclose this information. In some other countries they are, like in the United Kingdom, I think in Canada and maybe elsewhere. But generally speaking, the church is not compelled by law to do this. But if President Hinckley here is saying that the information, the financial information about the church belongs to those who made the contribution, I struggle to know what he was referring to. Because for more than half a century, those taxpayers, those tithe payers have been deprived of that very information. So I'm left a little confused by what he was referring to. I, again, don't allege any corruption or controversy. Frankly, I don't have access to any knowledge that would tell me one way or the other. But I assume, generally speaking, these are, honest people, not, embezzling money, not paying for things they shouldn't, not whining and dining people and living large at the expense of everyone else. That's not my point. That's not why we need transparency. We need transparency as a rule because we're humans and sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the Lord has charged us with running the affairs of the church, not through deference, not through just, hey, church leaders, do whatever you want and God will hold you accountable. I absolve myself of any accountability. I don't need to be aware or involved. No, the church says everything's done by the voice of the people, by common consent. You and I are as much in charge of the church as are the church leaders. But we can't be in charge. We can't be, it's like if I go to my board at my nonprofit and I don't give them the financial information about our organization, but I expect them to approve the budget or just trust me. Hey guys, I got this, So they, as the governing body of my organization, need that information in order to govern, in order to give consent to what I propose that we do. It's the same thing with the church. You and I are in charge of the church. Common consent exists for a reason. But if we're deprived of the information we need to make the decisions, we're not going to be able to make those decisions in any meaningful way that approaches consent. So I would love to see the church, not because of legal obligation, but out of voluntary disclosure, provide information to church members like they did for quite a long time before 1959. And if they think that the church has so much money right now that some members will be disincentivized to pay tithing, well, maybe those members, number one, had weak testimonies to begin with and would have eventually found themselves out anyways. But number two, maybe we have to have a reckoning about how much tithing we're actually supposed to be paying. You can go listen to that past musing. But number three, we shouldn't be hiding information out of fear and speculation about what may or may not happen in the future. We should be transparent, period. Period. Because we need common consent. Teach people correct principles, let them govern themselves. Do what is right, let the consequence follow. So I think we need to see that from the church as it comes to financial matters. A $5 million penalty from the SEC for what happened this week is chump change, obviously, when contrasted to the tens of billions of dollars that the church has under investment, which, by the way, church investments are not these separate, spontaneous, magical things that exist independent of contributions to the church. They are in excess of contributions to the church that were peeled away from the church and invested, just as my nonprofit and others take any excess donations we can justify saving for a rainy day, and then we go, invest it or do something with it. So this is all tithing money. I've heard over the years, church leaders, their salaries, their stipends, their living expenses, their et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not tithing money. It's paid from the investments of the church. Even this $5 million that they were fined, the church said would not be paid from tithing funds. It would be paid out of the dividends or the proceeds from the church's investments. But all of those investments originated with contributions from individuals. So in my mind, the investments need to be managed and treated the same way as the general tithing fund and contributions to the church, because it all stemmed from contributions. Just as my nonprofit, I've got my general funds and my bank account, but I've also got the long-term investments, and they all show up on the balance sheet together because it all originated from the same money, right? It's just we peeled some of it off for investments. So some people feel like they're more okay with church leaders being paid XYZ or whatever because it comes from investments and not from church funds. Or, the church invested in, City Creek or whatever happened. I don't think they invested in it, did they? Didn't they sell part of I don't know. The church was involved somehow in City Creek. And I remember at the time everyone was like, but it comes from the investment side of the church and not tithing funds. I don't care. To me, it's all the same bucket. It all originated from the same bucket. And I don't think the church should have more flexibility necessarily in financial accountability and transparency just because something was an investment. All that money stemmed from contributions to the church, and it should be regarded as such. So consider this my public invitation, in a sense, for things to change at the institutional level, for there to be more financial transparency. Am I losing sleep over this? No. Is this a hill I'm going to die on? No. But I do believe that this would lead to better outcomes. I think it would lead to actual common consent. I believe it's prudent for fallible humans to do, especially in massively large organizations where there can be a lot of waste here and there. I just think it's generally a good thing to do. And then perhaps we wouldn't have shenanigans like the SEC coming after the church and the church claiming that, we follow the law when they didn't, and the church saying we consider the matter now closed when I don't think it is closed. It's closed for the SEC. I think it's an open issue for church membership to be discussing, and how could our senior church leaders be getting bad legal advice from likely Curtin McConkie and intentionally trying to deprive church members of knowledge about the investments the church has made using the money we contributed to the church. So transparency solves a lot of this. And I think we need more of it. See you next Sunday.